Close your eyes and picture this. It's May 1995. You're standing in your parents' living room, wearing a dress that cost more than your dad's car payment, or a rented tux that smells like mothballs and broken dreams. Your mom is crying behind a disposable camera. Your date is sweating through their corsage, and somewhere in the distance, a DJ is setting up speakers that will blast "My Heart Will Go On" exactly 47 times tonight. If you went to prom between 1990 and 1999, you lived through something that will never exist again. Not just because of the music, or the fashion, or the technology, but because of 1,000 tiny details that made 90s prom a completely unique cultural moment. Tonight, I'm taking you back to the gymnasium that smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage desperation, where your biggest worry was whether your date would step on your dress during Stairway to Heaven, and your greatest hope was that someone, anyone, would remember this night as magical. By the end of this video, you'll remember details you forgot you knew. And you might just cry a little. Let's start with something every 90s prom goer remembers but nobody talks about: the absolute psychological warfare that was dress shopping. First, there was the call. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That phone call, on your house phone, with the curly cord stretched down the hallway, where Jessica calls to describe her dress in excruciating detail to make sure nobody else bought the same one. It's teal with sequins, and it has this off-the-shoulder thing with a slit that goes to here, but not like, here. And you're taking notes like you're planning a military operation. Because showing up in the same dress wasn't just embarrassing, it was social suicide. There were no Instagram posts to check, no group chats to coordinate, just phone calls, word of mouth, and the constant terror that you'd walk into that gym and see yourself across the room. But here's what really made 90s prom dresses special. They were architecturally impossible. I'm talking about dresses that defied physics, built-in push-up bras that could launch satellites, skirts so big you needed a friend to help you sit down, trains that required their own zip code. And the colors: electric blue that could be seen from space, hot pink that gave you retinal damage, neon yellow that made you look like a highlighter had an identity crisis. Remember trying to get in and out of cars in those dresses? Your date opening the door and you having to somehow fold yourself into a Honda Civic without destroying $400 worth of tulle and sequins? There was an actual technique to it, passed down from older sisters like ancient wisdom. Now let's talk about something that gave every 90s teenager a panic attack: the corsage and boutonniere coordination crisis. Remember trying to get in and out of cars in those dresses? Your date opening the door and you having to somehow fold yourself into a Honda Civic without destroying $400 worth of tulle and sequins? There was an actual technique to it, passed down from older sisters like ancient wisdom. Now let's talk about something that gave every 90s teenager a panic attack: the corsage and boutonniere coordination crisis. Picture this conversation happening in every American household in April 1997. "Mom, I need to know what color her dress is." "Did you ask her?" "I can't just ask her, that's weird." "Well, how are we supposed to get the corsage?" "I don't know, that's why I'm panicking." Because here's what younger generations don't understand. There was no texting, no social media, no easy way to coordinate without making it this whole big thing. You either had to call your date's house and potentially talk to their DAD, or you had to play telephone through your friends. But the real stress was the corsage itself. These weren't simple flowers. These were elaborate wrist monuments that weighed more than a newborn baby, roses the size of softballs, baby's breath that looked like a science experiment, ribbons that could double as rope in an emergency, and the pins. Those corsage pins were basically medical instruments. There was always that moment during pictures where someone's mom is jabbing a pin into their date's jacket, and everyone's holding their breath hoping she doesn't hit an artery. The wrist corsages were even worse. Trying to eat dinner with what essentially amounted to a small shrub strapped to your wrist, dancing with a floral arrangement that kept hitting your date in the face. By the end of the night, that corsage looked like it had been through a war zone. But you kept it. Everyone kept it. Dried it, pressed it in a book, or stuck it in the freezer like some kind of floral time capsule. Because even though it was ridiculous, it was your ridiculous corsage from your prom. Transportation to 90s prom was its own form of theater, and everyone was playing a role they couldn't afford. If you were lucky enough to have parents with a nice car, you became the designated driver for your entire friend group. Suddenly, your dad's Buick was the hot commodity, and you're trying to figure out how to fit 6 people in formal wear without crushing anyone's dress. But if you really wanted to make a statement, you went with the limousine. And 90s limo culture was something else. These weren't the sleek, elegant limos you see today. These were basically school buses dressed up for Halloween. White leather interior that stuck to your skin, a bar stocked with Sprite and pretzels, and a sound system that made everything sound like it was being played through a tin can. The limo rules were passed down like sacred law. Everyone chips in $20. Nobody spills anything on the white seats. The music gets chosen by committee, which meant you'd spend the entire ride listening to arguments about whether to play popular R&B or alternative rock. And there was always that one kid whose parents rented the most ridiculous limo possible. The one with the hot tub, or the disco ball, or the TV that only got static but everyone pretended was cool anyway. But here's the detail only 90s kids remember. The limo always smelled like industrial cleaner mixed with the cologne of 1,000 previous proms. That smell would hit you the moment the door opened, and suddenly you knew you were entering prom territory. The best part was pulling up to other people's houses to pick up your friends, and their parents coming out with cameras like you were celebrities. Your mom running alongside the limo taking pictures through the window like you were going to the Oscars instead of the Holiday Inn ballroom. Pre-prom dinner in the 90s was a carefully choreographed social event that had more rules than a diplomatic summit. First, there was the venue selection. It couldn't be too fancy because nobody's parents wanted to pay for expensive steakhouses, but it couldn't be too casual because this was prom. So you ended up at chain restaurants, pretending breadsticks were sophisticated cuisine. The seating arrangement was pure politics. Couples sat together, but not too together because someone's parents were always watching. Friends groups tried to stay clustered, but there was always that awkward moment when someone's date didn't fit in with the established social dynamics. And the ordering. Everyone trying to order something that wouldn't destroy their formal wear. No spaghetti because of the splashing. No ribs because of the mess. No soup because of the spilling potential. You ended up with the most boring possible version of everything. But the real entertainment was watching everyone try to eat in their prom clothes. Girls with elaborate updos trying to lean forward without destroying their hair. Guys in rented tuxes that were either too tight or too big, sweating through their shirts before the actual dancing even started. There was always that moment during dinner when it hit you. This was it. This was your prom. All the planning, all the stress, all the anticipation, and you were actually here, sitting in a chain restaurant booth in the most expensive outfit you'd ever worn, pretending to be grown up. Someone would inevitably get emotional and start talking about how much they were going to miss everyone after graduation. Someone else would take out their disposable camera and start snapping pictures of breadsticks because everything felt historic and important. Walking into your school gymnasium on prom night was like entering an alternate dimension. If that dimension was decorated by a committee with a every 90s prom, had the same basic transformation. Basketball hoops covered with fabric that never quite hid the fact that you were still in a gym. Streamers hanging from the ceiling like colorful cobwebs. A disco ball that was probably older than half the students. The theme was always something impossibly romantic and vague. A night to remember, under the stars, enchanted evening, midnight in Paris, as if hanging some twinkle lights could transport you from the place where you had to run the mile in PE to a magical wonderland. But you know what? It kind of worked. There was something magical about seeing your everyday school space transformed, even badly. The cafeteria tables covered with white tablecloths and plastic centerpieces became elegant dining areas. The corner where kids usually got detention became the photo backdrop. The punch bowl was always the centerpiece, a massive crystal thing that someone's mom donated, filled with what was essentially Kool-Aid in formal wear. And there was always that rumor that someone was going to spike it, but it never happened because Mrs. Henderson was standing guard like a prison warden. The DJ setup was usually just Mr. Peterson, the history teacher, with a CD collection and a microphone that cut out every third song. But he took requests on actual pieces of paper, passed up to his table like ancient scrolls of musical desire. And the smell, every 90s prom venue had that same smell. Cleaning supplies mixed with hairspray, cologne, and the faint aroma of whatever industrial carpet cleaner they used on the gym floor. It was the smell of formal teenage awkwardness. And if you smell it today, you're instantly 17 again. 90s prom music was its own category of cultural experience, and every song told a story about where you stood in the social hierarchy of slow dancing. The slow songs were pure social theater. Whitney Houston, Boys This End. To Men, Meatloaf. These weren't just songs, they were 3.5-minute relationship auditions. There was a whole science to slow dancing in the 90s. How close was too close? Where do you put your hands? Do you actually sway to the music or just stand there and rock back and forth like you're comforting each other? And the fast songs. Popular dance tracks turned every prom into organized chaos. The Macarena made everyone temporarily forget they were trying to look sophisticated. Line dances were mandatory, even though half the people didn't know the steps and just followed along hoping nobody noticed. But the real drama happened during the couple songs, when the big romantic ballads came on and suddenly everyone had to decide if they were movie romance level close with their date or just friends who went to prom together, close. There were always those couples who took the slow dancing very seriously, full romantic movie poses, dramatic dips, spinning moves that cleared out half the dance floor. Everyone else would watch and try to figure out if they looked romantic or ridiculous. And then there were the group dances. Every 90s prom had that moment when all the single people in friend groups would form their own dance circles because being alone at prom wasn't tragic if you were alone together. Prom king and queen in the 90s wasn't just about popularity. It was about navigating a complex social algorithm that nobody fully understood but everyone participated in. The nominations usually came out a week before prom, and suddenly the entire school turned into a political campaign headquarters. There were actual campaigning strategies, posters in hallways, vote trading between friend groups. But here's what made 90s prom royalty different from today. It wasn't about social media followers or online presence. It was about pure analog social currency. Who sat at the best lunch table? Who dated who got invited to the best parties? Who had the most friends across different social groups? The voting was done on actual paper ballots, handed out during lunch periods like a presidential election. And the secrecy was real. No exit polls, no early results leaked on social media. You voted, and then you waited. The announcement always came right before the last slow song of the night. The DJ would call up all the nominees, and they'd stand there in a line looking simultaneously hopeful and terrified, while everyone else held their breath. Winning was a weird mix of validation and embarrassment. You got a plastic tiara or crown that cost about $3.99, a sash that said Prom Queen 1997 in glittery letters. And the right to dance alone in the middle of the gym while everyone else watched and took pictures with disposable cameras. But losing was almost worse than not being nominated at all. Standing there smiling while someone else got crowned, pretending to be happy while internally dying, then having to dance to the last song knowing everyone was talking about how you didn't win. What happened after prom was often more memorable than prom itself because that's when the real personalities came out and the carefully planned evening turned into chaos. There was always the great after-prom debate. Do we go to Sarah's house where her parents are out of town? Do we go to the official after-prom party at the school with supervised activities and pizza? Or do we just drive around aimlessly in our formal wear hoping something interesting happens? The house parties were legendary, but not for the reasons you think. It wasn't about drinking or hooking up. It was about the surreal experience of sitting in someone's basement in a $400 dress, eating pizza at 2 a.m., while still wearing your corsage. But you know what was really memorable? The quiet moments. Sitting in someone's car in a McDonald's parking lot at 3 a.m., still in your prom clothes, talking about everything and nothing. The weird intimacy of being overdressed in completely ordinary places. Taking pictures with disposable cameras in 24-hour diners, surrounded by truckers and night shift workers who looked at your group like you were visitors from another planet. Which in a way, you were. You were visitors from the planet Prom, where everything was formal and important and magical. Here's what I want you to do right now. I want you to remember the smell of your prom. Not just how it looked or sounded, but how it smelled. That combination of hairspray and cologne and that weird gymnasium industrial cleaner smell. The corsage that was already starting to wilt by the time you got to dinner. The inside of the limo that smelled like 1,000 other teenagers' big nights. Can you smell it? That specific cocktail of anticipation, Aquanet, and teenage dreams that will never exist again because everything is different now? If you went to prom in the 90s, you were part of the last generation to experience it completely analog. No phones to document every moment. No social media to coordinate outfits or share real-time updates. No way to Google how to slow dance or prom etiquette. You just showed up and figured it out as you went. You relied on disposable cameras that might not even develop properly. You coordinated through phone calls and word of mouth. You experienced every moment in real time without the buffer of a screen. And maybe it was messier, more awkward, more uncertain than proms today. But it was also more present, more immediate, more yours. Because when you couldn't document every moment, you had to actually live them. When you couldn't coordinate every detail digitally, you had to trust that somehow it would all work out. And mostly, it did. Your 90s prom wasn't just a dance. It was a cultural moment that will never be replicated. You got to be teenagers at the exact intersection of formal traditions and emerging independence. Sophisticated enough to rent limos and wear expensive dresses, but young enough to think that dancing to romantic ballads in a decorated gymnasium was the height of romance. You were the last generation to experience true anticipation, not knowing how the photos would turn out until you got them developed weeks later, not knowing if your dress looked good until you saw yourself in the gym mirrors, not knowing if your date was having fun until you read their actual facial expressions instead of their social media posts. You were the last generation to experience true anticipation, not knowing how the photos would turn out until you got them developed weeks later, not knowing if your dress looked good until you saw yourself in the gym mirrors, not knowing if your date was having fun until you read their actual facial expressions instead of their social media posts. And maybe your prom wasn't perfect. Maybe your dress was uncomfortable, your date stepped on your feet, the DJ played Celebration 3 times in a row, and the corsage gave you a rash. But it was yours. Completely, authentically, messily yours. So here's to everyone who slow danced in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and dreams. Here's to everyone who kept their corsage in the freezer for 6 months. Here's to everyone who has a box of disposable camera photos from one night in the 90s when you dressed up like adults and pretended you weren't terrified of everything that came next. Your prom might be over, but the memory of that specific kind of magic, the analog, immediate present kind, that's yours forever. And nobody can take that away from you, even if they can't understand what made it so special. If this brought back memories you forgot you had, subscribe to it back to America 90s OOs. Because the 90s weren't just a decade, they were a feeling. And sometimes we all need to remember what that felt like.